Hi, my name's Eli Schwartz from the Learning Science team. Welcome to your Gateway to Understanding the Kaplan Way for Learning. This is part 1 of 3. Today, we lay down the foundation. Here are our 2 learning objectives. The Kaplan Way checklist, as you'll learn in a moment, lists 12 essential categories for making our courses better. You'll leave this part 1 of training able to describe the checklist and how it's used. You'll also be able to speak knowledgeably about the top 2 of those 12, the 2 categories most important for effective instruction and learning. Our warm-up will ask you about your understanding on the topic of learning, after which we'll explain the overall purpose of the checklist and what it covers. We'll make sure you know what happens to it, and at the end, we'll help you understand and define those 2 all-important categories. Before we jump in, how do you define learning? What experts would say is, learning is changing a person's actions and decision. It goes beyond declarative knowledge, the sheer knowing of facts and dates, to knowledge that we can use, procedural knowledge. And there are 3 fundamental elements. First of all, it's about doing things. If a lesson merely offers passive information or knowledge for its own sake, educational psychologists would say it hasn't gone far enough. Active instruction is all about changing how we, as learners, perform tasks. Next, it's always all about the learner and the goals the learner should be aiming for. The role of the teacher is, simply put, to guide the student towards those goals. Finally, the change should make the learner more of an expert. Whether you're teaching a kid how to drive or showing some LSAT adults how to sketch out a logic game, the purpose is to make those students better at what they do by learning how to do what the experts do. While we're at it, what does the Kaplan Way for Learning so far mean to you? Well, the Kaplan Way for Learning is the science-based approach by which we create what are called learning events. And that's a term that we'll be clear about. It's a learning event anytime 2 or more people get together and someone's expertise is being expanded or added to. Whether this is a huge class or one-on-one tutoring session, those all qualify as learning events. Here's a graphical illustration of the Kaplan Way. We follow it when building our learning products. We figure out what the expertise is that is needed. For instance, what does an MCAT expert need to know how to do in order to ace that test? We teach to that expertise, and then we measure how effective the teaching is and make revisions accordingly. All very logical, efficient, and very much data-driven to get the most out of each learning event. By way of review, what are the 2 necessary conditions of effective learning? It's focused on the learner, and it's always about how to do something. And what about the outcome? We're always looking for change, making sure that the student becomes progressively more expert. And lastly, how do we structure those learning events? We show students how to become more expert and go on to measure the results and evaluate them so as to make the learning events even better. Next, how do we determine whether and where the Kaplan Way for Learning has actually taken hold? Well, we have independent evaluators complete the checklist, and I'd like to share with you the process and the features and its overall purpose. The Kaplan Way checklist was developed as a way of evaluating the strengths of Kaplan academic products. If you haven't seen the checklist before today, notice that a Kaplan course is evaluated in 12 specific categories, each of which is broken down into 3 specific components or subcategories. Of course, that means 12 times 3 or 36 total rankings, and each of the 36 gets ranked 1 for yes, this is happening at least half of the time, or 0 for no, that's not happening or happening less than half of the time. Very, very occasionally, the evaluator may select NA for not applicable, but that's rare. Usually we stick to a 0 or 1, and you'll see why. Then, each of the 12 categories gets a single averaged rating. Here's how the final checklist evaluation looks before it's handed to a stakeholder, a performance unit or product team, let's say. The 36 subcategories are each rated and then averaged by category. A perfect score would be 12, ones everywhere, and this product has amassed a total of 7.6 out of 12, which is actually pretty good. Can you see one or two areas that this product will be encouraged to do better in? I'm sure you can. You can bet, at the very least, its personalization elements, category 12 in the bottom right, never mind what that means for the moment, that will get some close consideration, and so will category 1 objectives in the upper left, which we're going to see a lot more of soon. The evaluators, though, can't just offer numbers, they need to offer some additional opinions, including a PowerPoint summary where we use screen captures to show, not just tell, the reasons for their ratings, both pros and cons. After the stakeholders look over the summary, they sit down with the evaluators for a cordial but frank conversation about the ratings. The evaluators will make non-binding recommendations as to what is in most need of immediate attention, and then the stakeholders themselves decide which changes are to be made and when. At least they know, for sure, their decisions are based on objective and fair assessment and the principles of learning science. Objectives, I promised we would come back to, are really the heart of this whole thing, and so are the assessments involved. That's why it's crucial we start here with this pair. It's not enough to just write a bunch of phrases and call them objectives, like understand content X, Y, Z. They have to, of course, be announced to the learners up front, but additionally meet important criteria for how they're written. They have to be written as active verbs, something that the student will be able to do or perform or a skill, and at the same time, they have to be testable. We have to find out whether the student has actually developed greater expertise in that skill or performance area. Here's a sample learning objective that we would recommend changing. Can you see why? First, it's definitely not active. Will know is certainly a verb, but it's not a perform, it's not a do, it's not a skill. Secondly, it fails our testable requirement. It's impractical for us to try and test knowing of something as a whole. But rewritten, it is no longer vague, and we can test whether the student can match subjects and verbs. Same topic, but now the learning is expressed as a concrete skill, an action that can be tested at the end of the lesson. This is an example from the MCAT channel episode on blood. Notice the active words like characterize, identify, describe, and how X leads to Y, and that each of these objectives would be testable orally or through short answer questioning or even multiple choice at the end of the lesson. The student is now on notice as to what will happen during the lesson and what they'll be responsible for doing at lesson's end. Following up, Category 2 determines whether the learner has in fact been changed by the objectives, whether they have become more expert. Think of assessment as the act of figuring out or helping the student figure out whether they have achieved their learning objectives. The key rule of thumb is that assessments should be written in such a way that they allow the learner to work within actual, real-life scenarios, or even standardized test-like scenarios. For example, how would you test whether a student driver has mastered all of the parts of an automobile dashboard necessary for driving? Perhaps you would use something like this. One specific make and model of a car is front and center, very specific, and the student is seeing it exactly as she would see it if she was behind the wheel. And notice, plenty of space to describe each of the 8 features, what it is, when and how to use it, and Again, talking about using this skill in a real-world context. In your own words, what is assessment testing? We hope you've noticed it's testing the mastery of the student, how much expertise they've developed. In your own words, why are learning objectives so valuable? Remember, learning objectives are valuable because they maintain that laser beam focus on exactly one performance, one skill, one action that allows us to make concrete, high-quality learning events. And overall, good learning should have at least two things. That learning outcome should be clearly defined through that learning objective, and it had better be accessible or testable at the end to determine whether the students have increased their expertise. So far, we've also covered the basic way to use the Kaplan-Way checklist. What does a category have to do to earn a 1? It must be observed at least half of the time doing whatever that category is. For example, in objectives, that means at least half, hopefully all, of the lessons have learning objectives. That would earn it a 1 for a learning objective. After the Kaplan-Way checklist is completed, we do a few different things. First, a summary is presented with examples and a filled-out checklist. Remember, that includes the snapshots of pros and cons and that PowerPoint presentation delivered to stakeholders. Immediately after this, the reviewers and the stakeholders engage in conversation about the review. Hopefully, right away, that high-level learning science-based feedback is incorporated by the stakeholders or content developers or product in order to improve the learning events in their course. At this point, we hope you have an overarching view of what the Kaplan-Way checklist is, how we use it to go from analysis to product teams to final improvement of learning events, and the two overarching categories on the checklist. Keeping in mind, we'll review the other 10 in much more detail in the following 2 segments of this training. If any of these still need a little bit more clarification, or if there are any additional questions that this session has brought up, please reach out to the Learning Science team to ask those questions and provide that feedback. Our next session will break down the other 10 categories as they apply to content development and user experience. See you soon.